Hi, this is Privateer Station, and today we're bringing you day 693 of Russian invasion in Ukraine. As always, with former advisor to the Office of the President of Ukraine, Lieutenant Colonel Alexei Arestovych, and Ukrainian journalist Nikolay Feldman. Today's stream was 2 hours long, so we will be splitting that in two parts. Our special thanks go to our dear members. Today we do send kudos to Jmer and Zeni Gaming. Thank you for sticking with us for over a year. Much appreciated. And of course, Bill, thank you for your super thanks. And with this, let's deep dive into day 693. It will be a bit different stream. Enjoy. Hello everybody, this is Project Alpha, War Diary with Alexei Arestovych. He is online, connecting to our stream. Good evening, Alexei. Good evening, everybody. Let's start with the situation on the front. We have been criticized quite a bit that for several streams we have ignored the front line. And there is an interesting statement from British Intel, and perhaps it deserves some commentary. For example, it states that Russia cannot increase their successes near Mariinka. What's happening in Avdiivka is also a very limited success, and that's about it, really. And Ukrainian continue holding the Perch and Kherson region as well, on the right bank, sorry, on the left bank. Yes, Russian troops are trying to take back that territory, but they're failing. All right, so if we go over the front, the logic remains. And let's zoom out of this map. The hottest part is Krynki, the left bank of the river in Kherson region. Today, by the way, is a day of defenders of Donetsk airport. Our prayers and thoughts are with them. There was probably the first hottest event in recent history that lasted for that long and showed the heroism of our troops. But what's happening now in Krynki, it actually can probably overtake the events of airport, because a very small group of our troops that is being supplied across river is being constantly pushed by much larger Russian forces, and Russian forces keep wasting a lot of troops trying to get the territory. They are in a unfavorable condition because their bank is a bit lower and our artillery sees them from afar. Their leader Teplinsky, the head of the southern front, and the main troops he has there is Russian paratroopers. They're suffering tremendous losses on that bank. And our guys are holding a very significant group of Russian troops in that area. Why Russians expend so much efforts here is because direct line, it's only 75 kilometers to the mouth of Crimea. And if by chance our territory on the left bank increases, which is not going to be easy, they eventually will be facing a much more risky proposition of us getting to Crimea. Then we can take a look at Tokmak area. They somewhat shrank it by continuous offensive on all sides, and they're pushing back our troops roughly to the area of the first line, the one that we initially took that, and the field in front of it. So that area that is usually designed for the enemy to lose as many troops as they can before they get to your trenches, so they would not be able to take it. We, back in the day, actually crossed that, got into the trenches, and now we have to, actually went even further, and now we have to roll back to the trench. Mostly because they continue their relentless push, and, bit by bit, they try to push us back. Then we can go to Vuhledar, Mariinka, and Avdiivka. There, they also continue their effort, one way or another, especially near Mariinka. Over here, around Novomikhailivka, you can see the pincer attempt here, and try to push further towards Kurakhova in the middle of the map now, but they're not successful with it. Now let's go higher, Avdiivka, Stara Mikhailovka. They're trying to grow another flank here, and it's an old concept, small pincers, big pincers, like they were taught at school. They're trying to close that shape that we still hold. And, unlike despite the pessimism of some Arestoviches, we're still holding that area, which is good news generally, because the enemy continues to waste a lot of troops trying to take that. And you can see they're probably failing to take Avdiivka itself. You can see they're trying to expand further out toward Cheretine and trying to figure out where else they can find a weak spot, maybe complete that maneuver. The group there is still larger than ours, and they're in a better condition than we are, in better positions, yet still we're holding the territory, and that is definitely good news. If we go to the north, towards Bakhmut and the railroad, we can see that the enemy actually crossed the railroad in some places, and we had to roll back a bit. You can see they're pushing near Klishivka and Andriivka. Sad as it is, whatever we captured in that part, we're starting to give it back to them, just because they have more forces and means. Also, you can see a lot of arrows pointing to Chasiv Yar, right here, in the middle of the map again, and they're trying to get to Chasiv Yar. Essentially, that's their next goal. They're trying to fulfill that task. Let's go up north, Belogorovka, and the forestry, the silver forestry. And there are a lot of fighting happening there. In Telegram channels, you can see a lot of videos shot by Ukrainians, and very often you see the same situation when the fight is happening over a position of a platoon, and our soldiers take that, their soldiers come back, take it back, then we come and liberate it again. So that's kind of the push-pull happening there. Very intense, but very small groups. Now, near Liman, there are a couple arrows and some protrusions, and we can continue going north to Kupiansk. All that line, there is a lot of fighting happening there, but there's no major push in that segment of the front. Their main area of attention is Sinkovka, Kupiansk, over here. So this is a serious transportation hub, and this is a natural border along the river, but they're not really successful at that attempt. They're still hopeful, but they're still not experiencing any successes in that area. And the logic of Russian side, without having a decisive advantage, there are two kinds of advantage. There is just advantage, and there is a decisive advantage. There's also overwhelming advantage. But advantage is meaning that we have a bit more means, more guns, and the enemy has slightly less. Decisive is when we have notably more resources than the enemy does. And overwhelming is when, basically, when you need to be a complete idiot and your enemy could be genius, you will still overwhelm because of the numbers. So they don't have any decisive or overwhelming advantage, but they are still trying to get their goals done. And Putin was out today. He was giving a speech that deserves some analysis. And Russian army, despite all the effort, they cannot get to the level where they can conduct any successful operation on the operative side, operative level. Now, again, to remind the grading of operations, there is a tactical operation, which probably is 50 to 120 kilometers. That's tactical. Everything above that, that's operative, and 250 or 300 kilometers, that's strategic. So, given our front here, their capabilities are about 10 times smaller than that. They cannot conduct any operation with the whole length of the front, or at least 70, 100 kilometers, and depth of 50 to 100 kilometers, just like we did in Kharkov. Kharkov operation on our side was also can be qualified as operative success, operative tactical, and they're nowhere near that level. So the incongruence of their goals and capabilities and their military-industrial capabilities right now is glaring, and it births that effect that you can see. On the other hand, the Russian command understands that their main goal is not even taking cities and territories. Their main task is to make sure Ukraine wastes resources. and to make sure that Ukraine loses more troops on the front, just because they have deeper pockets, basically, and they have still advantage in armored vehicles, in shells, in artillery systems, and they're still manufacturing them, while we are mostly getting support by partners. And their task is to make sure that we run out of resources before they are restocked, and to try to knock out our more experienced troopers from the front, so they would have it easier. And that's essentially what they're doing on different parts of the front. So with this, an attempt for them, their attempts to keep taking different towns is a bit silly, because they don't really have direct task of taking them. But their logic is to try to continue the war of attrition. Their logic is that if Ukraine runs out of reserves, they will still take it. One can look at their offensive line and their maneuvers and say that, yeah, these attacks do not necessarily hold much logic in them, but if you draw a different logic through that they're also fighting a war of attrition, you can understand what they're doing and how they're doing it, how they're achieving it. If they had a bit different tactics, a bit different equipment, and a bit different approach to that, they might have even been successful. But for now, they're actually wasting their resources in a larger pace, faster pace than the Ukrainian side. They've lost over 400 different armored vehicles near Avdiivka, and that's several months of trying to take a small town. So they need to change, obviously, the training that they provide and the use of the resources, because it is futile to hope for any successes in this war, besides slow grinding and maybe taking it meter by meter. They cannot hope for anything different, but on the other hand, they still successfully solve the task of exhausting our capabilities. Alexei, you also mentioned in previous streams that they are preparing their reserves a bit better. Yes, that's true, better, but still not effective enough to break through our defense lines. And here is their dilemma they're trying to solve. If they qualitatively, not quantitatively, although quantity is also a quality, like Stalin said, but if they increase the capability of their troops to be able to resolve their tasks in a qualitative way, not in a quantitative way, I don't think this is going to happen in the near future. The problem is that they don't have enough experience on the ground. The ground troops usually lack this connecting capability. When those who would be normally training the new recruits, they usually get killed and wounded very quickly, especially on the platoon commander and company commander leaders. So this is their problem. They fail to quickly train their troops. And they have pretty good training for the officers, they have good radio electronic systems, but overall they are not catching up with the pace they need to have in order to qualitatively be capable of achieving their tasks. So still, they're rather effective overall. They're not as effective as they would need to be to successfully solve their tasks, but they're effective enough to continue wasting our resources, to continue the war of attrition. And if that pace continues for another half a year, and the volume of Western supplies will not increase, we will find ourselves in a very uncomfortable situation. So the main question here, would the Western supplies be fast enough to compensate the attrition we suffer at the front line? And mobilization, if we conduct it right, would or should probably also be able to replenish the troops, right? So there is another publication here about Russian equipment. Forbes had a publication about Russia probably running out of tanks, that they manufacture about 390 tanks a year, but they're expending a lot more on the front. They're wasting much higher numbers that they can afford. In February of 22nd year, they started with 2,800 tanks. Over 23 months of heavy fighting, they've lost over 2,600 of them. That is confirmed by independent analysts. So Russian leadership states that they got 1,500 of new and modernized tanks, but as Forbes states, the numbers are much smaller because Russia is not producing modernized tanks here, despite what Kremlin states. So one can run with numbers, but these publications do not happen when there is no problem, right? What do you think about it? Well, this is a systemic issue they suffer. They produced before the war about 100, maybe 120. So their way they get to 300 is that they restore the older stored models. And we destroy much higher numbers here on the front. Just near Avdiivka, we destroyed over 400 armored vehicles, not only tanks, but we essentially destroying their armored vehicles much faster that they can restock and replenish them. Their tank battalions are normally at half the assets. Where they need to have 31 tanks, they barely have 15, maybe 17. And this is a continuous problem for them because Russian tactics includes relying on their armored fists. They tried that near Avdiivka, and they were laughing for a while at us that some of our Leopard tanks got blown up on landmines in the south, and that's exactly the way they lost our tanks near Avdiivka. Now, they have T-90M, the newest tank that has some advantages, but they can definitely not make too many of them a year. And we recently saw a good video when two Bradleys essentially just won over that tank. It's a very astounding achievement, but yeah, there are ways to destroy them. So Russian problem is that unless they find a reliable source of supply in China or Korea or somewhere, they will find themselves in a situation when the lack of armor will force them to change the logic of their war, the style of their war, tactics and operative art, because they will not have armored fists to rely on. Perhaps they can create individual tank battalions and tank companies that could be used after the infantry, that would need to go first, and use them sporadically. But their main concept now is essentially fighting with small groups, because it's making us to spend precious artillery shells and mortar shells on the small groups. But one should not underestimate that, because we've seen some videos when 4 of their well-trained and rather professional troops managed to take a position where we had 10 of ours holding it. So again, this is an unusual situation, but for example, if there was a good mortar and artillery cover initially, and then 4 decisive troops came in, they can do that. Our troops do the same, so we have enough skill to do exactly that as well. But the problem is that in order to destroy a company on a march, or to kill 4 of their troops when they're approaching our positions, you need to spend about the same amount of shells, right? And resources, other resources, observers, UAVs. So this war is turning into a tactic of small storm groups that are heavily reliant on UAVs and FPV drones with some explosive charges. And some places, of course, they use tanks, but the strategy for tanks or tactics for tanks is to essentially come somewhere pretty far away from the front, show up for a second, destroy a couple targets or shoot at a couple things, and then disappear. Because if tank appears within the 5-kilometer distance from the enemy, it's pretty easy to destroy it. It is not going to live long if we see it. So the equipment starts to disappear bit by bit. It's definitely a war of attrition, and tank is still one of the most decisive means of war fighting. And on this war, it found itself in very disadvantageous position, and this is part of the technological dead end, where, according to Zaluzhny's article, both sides find themselves. That both sides cannot really continue offensive operations against each other. They need to either accumulate a lot more resources to throw during the attack, for example, 5 times more FPV drones, or 5 times more artillery, or 5 times more tanks, or we need to change the ideation of our fight and perhaps acquire new technological means. But no operative successes are possible with the tactics of small groups. Even if you train a lot of them, that small tactical motions will not grow into an operative success. So that basically creates a front line that is very stationary, with fight for every grove, every bush. And as our military are joking, our main specialty is attacking and capturing groves. There was also a publication in New York Times, Alexei, about cluster munitions that they lost their effectiveness on the front exactly due to the small groups of troops, because they're more effective to be used on large numbers of enemy. Right, so none of the means is decisive game changer. Some of them succeed to get there, but again, even those not for long. That's why Sun Tzu was saying that war doesn't like duration, because if it continues, the enemy will find solution for any of your advantage. And if you accumulate enough resources unexpectedly for your opponents, like Germany did back in the Second World War, and then overwhelmingly attack the enemy and destroy and whatever they have and achieve your goals, then you don't really have your opponent doesn't have time to react to that. Their Poles, for example, in the Second World War, they were fighting like tigers. They were successful and brave, and they even used the cavalry against tanks. But unfortunately, they had very small time window, and they failed to properly react to that overwhelming might rolling onto them. French were fighting better. They actually were defeated quickly, right? But there were jokes about how weak they were, but their stats held till 1944. For one tank that they lost, they destroyed more German tanks. For one plane they lost, they destroyed more planes on the German side, to such a degree that their records were holding up until 1944. They were fighting great. They just, again, failed to accommodate the tactics and strategy of Germany at that time that allowed them to conduct a blitzkrieg. Why was blitzkrieg so successful? Because you accumulate resources, you don't expand your resources over time, your enemy is overwhelmed, and they have no time to react to your strategy. So Germans and Wehrmacht, when they were still building tanks and didn't have enough, the Guderian troops were riding bicycles and bikes, learning new tactics as if they were riding tanks. The similar tactics is used now by Army of Israel when they're using about a half of their troops just for the Gaza sector, which is the weaker of their opponents. It would be much more difficult if Hezbollah was playing, and if Syria or Jordan would have joined, that would have been a whole other proposition. But they've been cleaning up Gaza Strip for 2.5 months, and it's a big expenditure of their shells and resources. Israel doctrine always relied on mobilizing a lot of their reserves for any conflict, and that allowed them to get quantitative advantage of the enemy. Of course, they're fighting in a qualitative way too. They have advantages there with technology and all, but they also have large, overwhelming troops, and they have good decisive tactics, and that's what helps them to achieve their tasks in a fast and rapid manner. Because Israel economy is rather small, it cannot survive long, protracted warfare. It'll be difficult. And right now they already start to rotate, to train, to prepare perhaps for the Northern Front, if that happens. And here we are facing a very long war of attrition with Russia. Here, a whole different set of laws are working. You can be very successful using ATACMS, right, locally. Unless you get 500 of them and you overwhelmingly use them on your main line of attack, then Russians would not have time to adjust and accommodate to them. But since we're getting them in a dripper mode, you get 5 or 10, maybe 15 at most, that gives Russians to accommodate. We were very successful using them in the first months, and then after that, they figured a way out how to deal with this problem. And that's the problem of the West. They give enough time for Russia to figure out how to deal with the new threat. And objective reason, they don't have enough resources to provide, and then subjective, some of them could, but they're holding and not doing it. So once again, if we do have some people who are hopeful for F-16 and more ATACMS and hoping that situation will change, I need to disappoint you. That situation will only change if single-handedly, like at one point of time, we'll get 500 ATACMS or 100 F-16s, then we will be able to change the situation on the front, at least in a short time frame. But the question is, will we ever get that many? And our opponents are in the same situation. They can only be successful, drastically successful, different from what they are now, if they find somewhere 700 more tanks, right? Or a lot more artillery systems or jets. Of course, you can talk about North Korean missiles and Iranian supplies and all, but for now, they're not enough. And that's why the headbutting of small groups of infantry by 10, 15 people on each side, with some FPV drones and artillery work, and perhaps cruise missiles on occasion, that will be the way this war will be fought for a long time. Do not, and I want to state here, do not expect any of the side to take significant territories or cities in the near future. All right, Alexei, but there are still some events happening indicating that Ukraine has certain new capabilities, and Ukrainian capabilities are increasing. Do you think we can call a historic event of this war, or at least this week, that we destroyed DRLO, the Intel airplane? Yeah, I think we can, Nikolay, because I think it's also the first one of that kind ever destroyed in any active warfare. So Ukraine showed a few examples here that Russia suffered severe navy losses from the country that almost doesn't have a navy, or shooting down that very specific plane recently. And we also hold the record of aerial means shot down starting since 1945. I don't think Vietnam or Korea has ever reached that. Zelensky said up to 26 aerial flight apparatus a day. I don't exactly remember that, but I quite sure remember a few days when we destroyed 10 just one day, and that's counting just jets, not even helicopters or anything. So yeah, we're still holding some achievements. And Alexei, people are asking and discussing what could have been used to destroy that. Do you know? Yes, I do know what was used, but I cannot disclose that. It's not in the public domain yet. All right, let's hold off on that question. Then, going back to the West, Dripper-like support, and there is publication from the Insider that Zaluzhny wanted a brave counteroffensive 1 year earlier, that United States considered to be too risky, and did not give enough means timely to continue expand on the success achieved in Kharkov. Yeah, right. By the way, tomorrow is 1 year since I left office of the president. And since some of the materials already spilled into the press, I once again need to mention that I never disclose anything that has not been brought into the press, and everything that I disclose, I make sure that at least it was brought in different publications, at least a couple times, and then I can elaborate more on that. But I'm not the one who will be disclosing secrets. So this is my principal position. So addressing that article, since it is already out in the public, indeed, our country was insisting that we should have been doing not Kherson operation, but Zaporozhye region operation. There was no Surovikin lines. Russians did not have enough concentration, and we had definitely better chance of running to Melitopol and definitely to Tokmak, collapsing Russian front. And if we have done that maneuver successfully, then Russian troops on the right bank and Kherson region would also start wavering, because now they would be facing a cutoff from supplies on the landline, and they would definitely start to roll back as well. So that was one of the strategic mistakes in this war. But for various reasons, both our side and our colleagues and advisors from abroad, they insisted on Kherson. And on one hand, we liberated it. On the other hand, that created a current stalemate and lack of success during the summer campaign. Recently, Ben Hodges mentioned that the key, and Zelensky said about it, talk about it too, that Crimea is the key to this war. And that's when we needed to go to Crimea. After Kharkov operation, I think that was one of our major mistakes in this war. And we made quite a few mistakes. This was one of the key mistakes. That was even before we wasted too many troops near Bakhmut. So the risk of failure of this operation, how do you gauge that? If it failed, what would happen? Well, what would have happened? Russians would have still been holding Kherson. We would eventually have gotten there. It's hard to hold the isolated bank. eventually we would have taken it. And I don't think we would have failed because they did not have Surovikin lines. They had huge gaps between their troops. And the ones that were fighting on the front line, they did not have anything in the second line to support if you punch through. And that's exactly what happened in Kharkov operation when we took back so much territory. And I sincerely regret that Zaluzhny was overruled. I think it was one of the biggest mistakes we made. So who did not listen to Zaluzhny in this case? Everybody? Well, let's say political leadership and our Western partners. I think their actions were to a degree coordinated and they were dictated by their political goals. Because the Southern Front could not give them any guarantees for those people who demand guarantees, and liberation of Kherson is definitely a political achievement. I would not rush to tell that office of Zelensky is the bag of scoundrels who made these mistakes, but one needs to understand that it's politicians who are always managing the war. Soldiers and troops and military are usually carrying out the most difficult part of that work, but it's politicians who are making decisions of where to use them. And the history of all wars, without any exclusion, they're filled with conflict between politicians and military. Because politicians demand immediate successes and military then point, no, we'd better do this or that instead. And then it depends upon their relations between the politicians and the military generals. For example, in Hitler's command, there were situations when marshals accused him of losses on the battlefront because he made faulty decisions, for example, holding Stalingrad and then a big breach that resulted of that. But in reality, those who study the history of the Second World War, they know that several decisions that were insisted upon by Hitler and other politicians, despite of all the grumbling of the military, they turned out to be successful. So there is an interesting thing. A strategy that was used initially and failed to be successful, in lieu of protracted long conflict, can again become successful much later. But again, it can become successful again. Or something that was very successful initially, after the enemy got themselves together, eventually can grow out of its effectivity. And here is the problem. The question, what is the dilemma? What is more beneficial, to continue insist on your long will and strategy despite the fluctuations and successes, or try to resolve matters in a more flexible way, to try to use things that are more effective at this moment? And there are two approaches. One that says, yes, you need to be flexible, and your strategy needs to be flexible. And the second one says, that's only your nice wishes, it's all good and dandy, everybody wants to be rich and healthy, but these flexibility motions are only available when you have well-trained army, good relations with political leadership, enough resources, and enough tools that are capable of listening to such a flexibility, of actually carrying out the war, the flexible war strategy. And very often you just don't have that, and we don't have that. And it's very difficult to find politicians or military who can conduct successful continental war of a huge scale without, losing troops, without learning several bloody lessons. You cannot buy these people in store. So you only train them as the war goes. And I would say we did not have chances from the beginning to be more effective than we were. We could probably increase it by 15 or 20% just in the framework if we administered things better. But I don't see us having an opportunity to make a giant leap, turn into some Napoleons or Genghis Khans. But we could have used the existing resources more successfully. But thankfully, this is a more detailed question and matter to discuss. Audience at large could not discuss that, just to the nature of these things. And I would say that Putin made about 15% of those necessary decisions to beef up their position by those 15%. And we unfortunately did not make those decisions, so we're now fighting at a 20% less advantage than we could have. And this is the fact of our biography. So some people who are saying, if we would have done that, everything would have been changed. No, not everything would have changed, but we could have increased our capabilities by 15 or 20%, I think, objectively. And I think we just were not working diligently enough. We did not that we did not do anything, but we were not fully effective in what we did. And we continue on that line. And this is the war of attrition where you need to amp up your effectivity. That's your main factor that you need to be very concerned about. All right, so about new means that at least are temporary game changers, as we can follow with the titles from Financial Times. Russia is taking a temporary advantage on radio electronic warfare fight against Ukraine. So they're discussing the conditions of Russia and Ukraine technology and saying that Ukraine is still in a catching up mode. Yeah, indeed, Russia invested a lot into radio electronic warfare. They started doing that after they ran into effective radio electronic warfare means that they encountered in Georgia when they got a lot of jets downed, the number of friendly fire that downed their own jets, and the fact that Georgian artillery was playing much better counter battery fire. So they set a specific goal after getting face slapped with Georgia that they need to amp up their radio electronic means. And in 14th and 15th, 16th, they were already doing better than we were, several times better. And since then, they elaborated further. So now they actually have radio electronic means that can, if to put it in simple words, for civilians, they have means that can derail Excaliburs and HIMARS missiles. They're targeting systems. And this is, we're not talking about aviation, they're rather weak, but there's more expensive to produce and more expensive, more difficult to use. But ground-based radio electronic means are very successful. All right, let's take a look at Putin's speech and his words, because behind those words we can discuss other things, Davos and contra-agreement with Britain. So it appears that Putin is trying to respond to these world events, and the first statement that he made was, Ukraine refused from negotiations with Russia, idiots, everything would have been over long time ago. So that rhetoric in such a tone, do you think it's the contract between Britain and Ukraine, the agreement that we've signed, and Davos meeting? I think these events are not really making them happy, and that's why the tone. No, Nikolay, I will express a very unpopular point of view. This is my estimation. You may agree or disagree, but this is my job to say uncomfortable truth. So the way I see that, when I'm looking at Putin, I understand that, and I see that he sincerely regrets that this war lasts for that long, and this is his historic mistake. Not that he regrets it, but in that he doesn't understand his role in the unfolding events. Do you know what will be a very dangerous sign for me with Putin? If he will pay attention to two institutions in Russia, Russian school education and the Institute of Philosophy of Russian Academy of Sciences, basically a humanitarian aspect of Russian inner life and, first of all, history. Because, as I said many times before, he was very pro-Western politicians, until the West spat in his face so many times that he finally became their nemesis. Remember in recent press conference when he was asked, what do you regret most of all? He answered that I trusted my partners. And that is true. He was very pro-Western in all his logic. And from his point of view, the West deceived him many times over. He understands that now, but since I do understand a bit about people, as far as I think, and I see that he understands that, but he's refusing to believe it. So my verdict is that these agreements that we had in Turkey, they were ideal. We would not have gotten better agreements. They were covering two crazy traps that were hanging over our heads from the previous negotiations. Norman format, I mean Minsk I and Minsk II. Istanbul agreements were about full withdrawal of Russian troops from the occupied territories. And full withdrawal, not to the 23rd of February, but to the whole territory. So in exchange for neutral status, right? But for that status, we also would have gotten a chance to discuss Crimea in 10 or 15 years. So they were ready to even put that sacred cow on the table for that. And he, of course, is putting enough deceit in his speeches, but you can tell certain things by the way he makes statements. And he says nobody had your independence in our crosshairs. And this is a very uncomfortable statement for Ukrainians. Since I'm not afraid, I'm just saying what I think. I'm a free man in a free country, and I hope Ukraine is still that country. He indeed has not attacked our independence. And when he's saying that they wanted demilitarization and denazification, that's exactly how he saw that. We understand we have some legends about them trying to fully annex Ukraine. That was not the goal. And he is very puzzled and bewildered by what is happening. He's not fully understanding what is happening now. And he did not understand why did we refuse from those, did we walk away from those agreements? Because he understands the bonuses that were offered. That's why he's using the word idiots. And there was a neutral status. Because Ukraine, when we initially became an independent country, we outlined the neutral status. So he's saying somewhat truth that, yeah, indeed, we had initial agreement that Ukraine will be neutral. Then he adds a bit more lies or just presents it in the most favorable light for himself about the annexation of Crimea. But when it's difficult to penetrate somebody's mind, I always suggest to look into the situation from a different angle. Just make it in a different part of the world. Imagine there is a pro-China union somewhere, soft but somewhat American, anti-American direction. And all of a sudden, Mexico decides to join this alliance. How would the United States react to that? Right? But honestly, I would think in the same fashion that they've dealt with General Noriega in Panama, in the same fashion that they dealt with Grenada or Hussein. With Mexico, it would have been probably rather fast and hard. So that's roughly what you can see in Russian reaction. And we played a very interesting children's game here in Ukraine. We announced that our goal is independent politics because we are free people, we can choose, right? Nothing is wrong with that. Nobody should be attacking us for our free choice. This is treacherous to attack us for our choice because we wanted to be that. And while saying this, we destroyed the biggest military group that remained from Soviet Union and destroyed our military-industrial complex. So the problem is not that we set the wrong goals only, but we also destroyed our means. And we continued anti-Russian politics, and we were not ready to face the consequences of this. Because the price for anti-Russian politics, or in general, not a single country of the world can afford an enemy on the border. They cannot afford another country that is hostile to them on the border. So if they seriously considered us to be hostile, regardless of how much we swore that we are not enemies, they saw us in this light. But we failed to preserve any means to defend our political independence. And now we're paying for that madness, political madness. And historians, I guess, 100 years from now will be studying it as a situation when mass hypnosis, I think in Africa, they have an interesting belief that when a woman is washing clothes in the river, it says that in order to not be eaten by a crocodile, you need to be standing your back to the water, that the crocodile doesn't attack your back. So you don't even see that. I think this psyop was invented by crocodiles, and they probably paid somebody money to propagate that, because that's the best way, right? And we remind me in the pre-war years of that woman by the river with her back to the crocodile, pretending that there is nothing, right? And just like we had a meme during Maidan, I'm just a girl, I want my fancy pantyhose, right? So, despite of who is in power in Ukraine, if you are conducting a political course that is different, very different, and very non-complementary or even hostile to your neighbors, you should be preparing for that, right? That there'll be a conflict around it. And I was talking about that for the last, I think, 10 years already. But for the last 20 years, everybody was putting me as a Moscow spy or painting me in some other colors. My first conflict was in my own military intel when our security service called me after my report from Moscow. When I was returned, I was called upon and asked, why, Captain, do you want to quarrel our two brotherly nations, right? So that was the Ukrainian reaction from within. And I observed how we continuously, that we would not even be able not to do any independent and hostile politics, but no politics at all, frankly, by the way everything was unfolding here. And everybody here, the main position was like, what war? What are you even talking about? Are you crazy? Who needs us? Well, look at the front line. Who needs us? So all that pulling tiger by the whiskers without refusing to understand and falling into that mental stupor, the consequences of these actions brought us to the situation when we have war and they're conducting that special military operation, as they call it, intended to denazify and demilitarize. And by the way, these terms were removed from the contract from the agreement we were talking about in the March of 22. And that's why he's calling us idiots, because he understands the bonus that was offered to us, the one that we refused. And now we have additional year of this war, actually almost 2 years now, and hundreds of thousands of dead and wounded. And he gives us a clear sign that this offer will never be available again. And moreover, he's giving us a message that, first of all, they will not release what was occupied, and he understands that the consequences for Russian economy may be more dire, but they will continue their efforts despite the cost, regardless of the cost, because he wants to have the next offer at the table when there'll be a discussion, negotiations, to be much more advantageous for Russia and much less advantageous for Ukraine. They already reiterated that they're not going to give back for occupied territories and Crimea. Back in the previous agreement, they were giving them back, or Crimea put under discussion. So now their effort is trying to make it worse. And every next offer, as he implies, will be worse and worse and worse until Ukraine changes its course. And he again outlines that by our decree, we stopped the negotiations, so we cut your opportunity to have a better option, better offer at the table. And Russia will continue to make it worse, worse, and worse until Ukraine agrees. So here comes our president in Davos and says, go fuck yourself, and you're an animal, and we shouldn't even be talking to you. And the whole audience is clapping, applauding for a long time. Everybody is excited. Everybody is saying that the Ukrainian president is the best and the strongest, who will not give up. So now we have two vectors that are very well defined. One of them says next offer will be worse. The second vector says we will not negotiate with you. It seldom ever happens in the crucial moments, but yeah, we have it now. So what happens after? Protracted warfare. Forget about negotiations. Till next offer, right? Let me clarify thing here, Alexei. What I'm getting triggered by is your story about independence, that we should consider his statement to be true, but I cannot understand how do you not attack the independence of the country when your troops are next to the capital of that country. Well, he did not want to take our independence. He wanted to have neutrality. So what is independence then? Okay, I understand it's a little difficult to grasp, and I understand there'll be a lot of things burning with some of our ultra patriots. Right, we're just making a philosophic discussion here. Okay, so follow the vocabulary: denazification and demilitarization. Where, and neutral status. Where is taking away independence? Well, formally, I understand what you're saying, but in reality, when you already used your armed forces, and as you gave an example before, out of 20 rooms in your office, 9 all of a sudden are occupied by your vicious enemies. Why do you think they even brought their troops to the territory of Ukraine? To insert a puppet regime, right? Yeah, puppet regime, but formally it is independent. And they would have taken even a lesser influence, not even a Belarus version, because they're not ready yet to technically annex Ukraine. They even now understand they're technically not capable of taking over, because their experience tells them that in order to take Grozny and Chechnya during the first and second Chechen wars, Chechnya is half the Kiev region. They aggregated 450,000 troops, and it took them a long time with a lot of bloody fighting to take Grozny. And they suffered partisan warfare for about 2 years, suffering 50,000 every year killed. And their productivity was very subpar to that task. So they understand that in order to take the whole Ukraine, they don't have enough guts. Stalin created 4 armies to take Ukraine back during the Second World War. The troops they invaded with, yeah, you could have done that special operation, demilitarize some, create political crisis, and either change the course of this current government or bring another puppet regime that will be friendly towards them. Because the goals of Russian politics, and I said that at Golovanov's stream, it exists for hundreds of years, that the countries bordering Russia will either be friends or will become part of Russia. And becoming a part of Russia is always option number 2. At first, they'd like you to be friends, or at least neutral. So they were fighting to lower Ukraine's potential, military potential for fighting another war, to bring it down. Because if we are part of NATO or independently against Russia, opposing Russia, they wanted us to be weaker. And second element was to diminish what they call Bandera and political ideology, that they don't like, the national ideology for Ukraine that they hate. And Putin was making statements that Ukrainians have gone mad, they stopped speaking Russian, they're not allowing Russians to live there freely. And we in return said, well, go F yourself, right? And that's what we got in return, because Putin started his military operation and this whole war. And, you know, some people are attacking Medinsky and his level of representation for the Turkey negotiations, so for Istanbul agreements. I would say, guys, don't muddy the waters. I know the level of those people who were there. I have seen Medinsky reaching out to Putin every 3 minutes, verifying every step. So everything there was for real. The agreement was serious. We could have signed it. But for whatever reason, and I'm not accusing Johnson here, we have not done so. So then they switched to prolonged, protracted warfare. And now I want to elaborate on why Putin does not understand his role. And I'm watching him very carefully, looking for when he will start dedicating more time to philosophy and school history education inside Russia. He does not understand that it is the history that is guiding him. He is a very rational figure. Everything he says is extremely rational for the officer of KGB and for the officer of Russian enforcement agency in the way that they see world. I have not noticed a single irrational step from Putin since 2000. So he is not understanding that there are irrational factors at work, that he did not have chances to sign this agreement. And we can regret not signing just theoretically. His idiots not signing it, theoretical regret, same thing for us, because this process was guided by history, and he is also guided by history. The sign that it was a larger picture that intervened, that it is a larger historic hand that was intervening into the process, because the easiness with which he created or elevated this conflict from Russia, Ukraine to the global south, global east against global north, northwest, and BRICS, the tempo of that group, how much they acquiring new countries, and these countries are very different, like Iran and Brazil and Saudi Arabia, right? They're very different participants. Arab Emirates, Iran, right? being geopolitical foes, all of a sudden, and rather rapidly, they jumped into the same boat, into the same organization. So that whole story tells that the sum of contradictions was much higher than the sum of contradictions between Russia and Ukraine, and even the sum of contradictions between Russia and NATO. And that is why when I say that I came out with a proposition to create a new security system in the world, or at least in Europe, or at least in Eastern Europe, I understood from the get-go that the chances for that are very slim. And for my personal, excuse me, renommee, that will be rather painful, because I would have retained my popularity if I stayed and continued saying that no negotiations, no conversation with Putin, etc. But I did want to remain in history as somebody who suggested that we need to figure out new security system for the world, because the only alternative to that is next 15 to 20 years of wars. As I said in my early streams, to 2035 roughly, right? It will not be going as one single world war. Likely there'll be different breaks, different fires in different parts of the world. It'll be protracted through time, and it will be happening across different territories. And due to low qualities of politicians currently in power and the policies that are being implemented, and of course that all led to mental disarmament and then actual physical disarmament of the West, and yet India, China, Iran, and many countries of the South and Southeast, and Russia are still eager to fight and ready to fight if need be. So many people, what our Ukrainians don't get is that many of them think that the West is the West of Reagan and Thatcher. And if they shrug their shoulders, Russia will be no more. They're not like that anymore. Europe is sincerely trying to be useful. Germans are trying to arm themselves. And the United States is almost not capable of doing it, but Iran is provoking them, pulling them everywhere they can. But you can see that their answer, even towards Hussites, was very limited. So a situation for war, none of the sides is capable of quickly and overwhelmingly destroying each other. But the axis of evil, so-called, is ready and eager to waste millions of people fighting for their ideas. We can call them funny, we can call them orcs, we can call them evil, but they're ready to sacrifice the lives of people in order to reach their goals. And our allies collectively are not. It's only Ukraine that is fighting. And part of our partners are afraid, others undervalue the level of conflict, and some group are really trying to revive everything, but they're failing so far, or doing it rather slow. So, guys, just give it a thought for a sec. What is our choice here? We understand that there'll be no peace at the moment. At the current state, it's a protracted, long, and very serious war. And Ukraine is facing Paraguay warfare style. And I would remind our viewers that in the 18th century, Paraguay won with several of its neighbors, had actually won this war, they fought that war successfully, but they have expended over 70% of their male population. And before the war, they had a good economy, it was on the rise, there were good hopes that there'll be a strong country in the region. After the war, they actually had to consider men having multiple wives in order to replenish their population. So if you think that this is the path for war, that's your prerogative. I do not agree with you. I think one of the main gauges for the government, for the regime, or for the leader in the country is population. Has it grown or has it dwindled? And for me, the situation when people are paying for ideas and political course that is not supported by anything, and I mean here our race to EU and to NATO, in situation when neither NATO nor EU are ready to accept us or defend our position, I would call that a crime against our people. And I, as a Ukrainian officer, I gave my oath not to the government. This is not an Ukrainian oath of an officer. I was giving an oath to people of Ukraine. And you can consider me 3 times traitor, but I'm defending the rights and the destiny of our people the way I see it. And I'm saying that politics of Ukraine going to NATO and EU is not supported at the moment. Those organizations are not welcoming us with open arms. And for us, joining them means a big war. For them, us joining them, accepting them in the orgs, means a big war with Russia. And I think that us continuing this politics on the third year of this war, I think it's a crime. And this is my answer. And the problem is not that it's Zelensky's office or Poroshenko or somebody else is insisting on that. The problem is that our population, our citizens, without fully understanding the picture that nobody else wants to pay that price for that situation, and having not a gram of way to provide that for themselves, neither economically nor militarily nor mobilizationally, without having a chance to follow through with this idea, we still picked this up. And just like in Postovsky book, with a strong belief in the purple light, they continued following that purple ray of light. And just ask, without names, just let's ask our viewers, what would they call people who very stubbornly, understanding that they will not win, they've already pawned their car and a house and wife and everything, they're already sitting in their underwear in the casino, but still betting. Do you know how it's called? Ludomania, right? Yeah, doubling the bets without having any chances to win on its own. So for Ukraine, ideally, hypothetically, it would have been a best conclusion to sign up that agreement. Unfortunately, the history didn't allow us to do that. And even a better position for Ukraine would have been to conduct neutral politics. And then there would not be any war. To be continued in part 2.